Okay, this is the final part of Chapter 30 lecture on Introduction to Animals. So we wrapped up in the final lecture discussing a little bit about the sensory organs and the development of animals in terms of the evolutionary impact and diversification of the nervous systems and muscular systems. We can also look at how animals have diversified in terms of their specific ecological niche. So an ecological niche is the role in which an animal plays in its environment and allows different types of animals to coexist with plants um, and other organisms in the ecosystem. So animals, based on their what they eat, can be defined into four categories here: detritivores, herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. I'm sure you've heard these terms before. But detritivore are going to be like earthworms. They feed on dead organic matter and ultimately return nutrients to the soil. Herbivores strictly feed on just plants or algae. Carnivores feed on other animals, and omnivores have the ability to eat both. Get the energy from both plants and animals. So the impact on the organisms consumed can also be used to categorize the ecological impact of animal consumption. So if you think about kind of the circle of life here, if everything was an herbivore, or everything was a carnivore, there we wouldn't have balance in the ecosystem. So very important to have this diversification in the ecological roles, and things that animals eat. So again, here's some examples of the groups: the detritivores and millipedes, feeding on the decaying leaves, providing a very valuable ecosystem service. Carnivores, eating strictly other animals. So there's an owl there, an example of predator. Herbivores feed on just plants and algae, like pandas. Very specific niche for pandas. They eat mostly bamboo. And omnivores will eat anything: plants, animals, fungi, protists, archaea, and or bacteria. So they have humans there as the example, but there's also bears and pigs. Lots of things that fall into the category of omnivorous species. All right, so let's look at some of the strategies in which animals eat, and it has to do with their mouth parts, really. So the varying ways in which we see animals eating and the four strategies are going to really closely correlate with its method of eating. And that makes sense because evolution has to favor the best strategy for getting food. That's a major thing. Eating, reproducing, right? These are all things that drive evolution. So the first one are your suspension feeders, your filter feeders. They basically have a whole lot of structures that are going to trap suspended particles. For these, we're talking about usually stuff in the ocean like sponges. They're going to, trap plankton and other small organisms drifting in the current. Bivalves, clams, mussels basically pump water through their body, and as the water goes through their body, they're going to filter out the food that they need. Some, pump it through their gills. Whales, you may have seen baleen whales or whales that kind of filter that plankton through, right, are all examples of suspension feeders, right? Deposit feeders, these guys are different. They're going to digest organic matter in the sediments. So their food is going to have is really essentially going to be things that are going to be loaded up in the sand. So things like bacteria, archaea, fungi, protists are going to fall under the deposit feeders. So essentially, a deposit feeder is going to take in all the dirt and filter out the dirt and just get the food they want. So we see deposit feeders as being like earthworms, or for example, one of them, and we see them as well in the ocean. Deposit feeders too. So very diverse group. Fluid feeders. These are going to be like butterflies. They go in and they use like a straw and they feed on things like nectar. There's some bats as well, I think, that do that. Flies, you've ever seen them kind of actually push out their esophagus and they suck things up. So these are all deposit feeders, or I'm sorry, fluid feeders. And then mass feeders, these are, like you and me, we just shovel in chunks of food into our mouth. So make sure you understand the distinction between those different types of feeders. And to help you do that, there's some great pictures here. So you got your suspension feeders. For example, here are the barnacles capturing food out of the particles. You can see they've got those, specialized legs that capture the plankton. There's your deposit feeder here. Sea cucumbers use their tentacles to take in everything, and then they filter out ultimately the stuff they don't want. The fruit fluid feeders are going to take up fruit juice, plant sap, blood, nectar, and mosquitoes fall under that as well. And lions just taking huge bites. These are your mass feeders. So the names really do correlate. Where are we? With what they do, with how they eat, and the mouth parts have evolved to reflect that. Okay, so that's eating. How about movement? So we talked about movement as being a major characteristic of animals. So animal locomotion provides a whole lot of important functions. So finding food, finding mates, escaping from predators, migrating to new habitats. So virtually all animals have one or more types of skeletal system that allows them to move. And the type of skeletal system that they have is going to lead to this highly variable movement that we see. So take a look at the different types of limbs that exist. So we got lobe-like limbs. Okay, these velvet worms use lobe-like limbs to crawl. Jointed limbs on the arthropods, okay, like the crab. Tube feet, all right, tube feet, like in the echinoderm shown there, the sea star. All right, parapodia. Here we've got two podia having to do with the feet, para on both sides. And then look at the tentacles in the octopus. So very different types of limbs here. And the ways in which these organisms move and undulate is very different. So very interesting there in terms of the movement. And we see the evolution and the major types of jointed versus unjointed limbs not actually coming from a common ancestor, and from that, there's been various debate and things about the evolution of that, but there's a lot of diversity in the way that animals move. Reproduction. So again, one of the very important aspects, probably the survival and reproduction being the two most important things that drive natural selection. So natural selection being, individuals with the alleles that are the most likely to allow for that individual to survive and reproduce natural selection is going to favor them, which makes sense. Natural selection, the best adapted are going to survive. That being said, there is a high degree in variation based on how animals reproduce. And that has to do with what niche they occupy. And how they coexist in their different ways in which they eat, move, and now reproduce. So let's look at some of the different ways in which reproduction occurs. So we've got, first of all, the major groups asexual and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction involves a genetically identical clone and everything. There's no diversity in asexual reproduction, so this is fast. It requires only one parent, but you don't get any diversity with that. All right. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves the union of egg and sperm to produce genetically distinct offspring from each other and from the parent. So that can happen either externally or internally. So external fertilization in cellular reproduction involves releasing egg and sperm out into the external environment, and then fertilization occurs out there. So there's definitely pluses and minuses to this. Major plus being that you don't have to expend energy to find a mate. You just release your egg and sperm into the open water. The drawback to this is that now your egg and sperm are vulnerable and less likely to find each other. Whereas an internal fertilization, which is the preferred kind of method for the most advanced animal species, the fertilization occurs inside of the animal. So in this example here of the damsel flies are copulating, the male holds the female behind her head with claspers, and the female retrieves sperm from the male sperm transfer organ with the tip of her abdomen, and the fertilization occurs inside of the female. So there's no chance that the egg and sperm are going to not come together, as is the case with external fertilization, where they can be eaten or something like that. So modes of embryonic development following. So once internal fertilization takes place, it can be a little bit different depending on the type of animal. So most mammals are viviparous, meaning that they nourish the embryos internally and give birth to live young. Oviparous species deposit fertilized eggs. So in insects and birds, embryos are nourished by the yolk. And in ovoviviparous, the species retain eggs internally and give birth to live young. So we see this in guppies and garter snakes. All right, so different kind of situation here. And viviparous is live birth, live young. Oviparous, laying eggs. Ovoviviparous, you're laying eggs inside of you, if that makes sense, and giving birth to live young when the egg hatches inside. So kind of interesting ways to think about embryonic development. Okay, there's been the fertilization, and now we've got life cycle. So we talked about life cycles with protists and with plants, and you're going to see that the life cycles for animals are much more simple, much more familiar to you. So sexually reproducing animals have a diploid dominant life cycle, which means that the fully developed animal is going to have the full number of chromosomes, and it got that full number of chromosomes by the haploid gametes coming together. So the egg and the sperm are your haploid, and they're coming together, and those are single-celled, short-lived. But there are exceptions to that general pattern. One of the more spectacular innovations is metamorphosis. So some animals, like butterflies, caterpillar butterfly, we see it with the larval stage of anemone, or urchins, I should say, going from a larval stage to an adult stage, going through this metamorphosis. So a big difference in metamorphosis and change. So here you can see the life cycle of a anemone. Or no, a sea urchin. Why do I keep saying that? Anemone. Sea urchin, excuse me. So here is our motile sperm and egg. And if you ever get the opportunity, some courses, I think I did it in one of my college bio courses, I can't remember, we definitely bred these. They're very easy to breed. But anyway, they're easy to kind of see what happens and manipulate. But you got sperm, you got eggs that come together. These are both haploid. And through fertilization, you end up with a diploid zygote. Okay, the embryo grows and differentiates, and you get this larva, which is motile. This thing moves, and it's diploid. It's going to go around. It's going to try to find a spot, and it's going to latch onto a certain spot. And when it finds a spot, it's going to undergo this metamorphosis to become a fully grown urchin, which looks nothing like the larval stage, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's just go through some of these key lineages of animals that we've been discussing. So the phylum Porifera, those are your sponges. Okay, they're multicellular, like we've said. They don't have true tissues. They don't have muscles, symmetry. They don't have nerves, but they are considered to be suspension-feeding animals. Phylum Cnidaria, these are your jellyfish, your coral, your sea anemones, your hydroids. There's about 12,000 or so known species of these guys. They live in the marine, freshwater environments. You guys know what a jellyfish looks like. They can reproduce sexually and asexually. I believe they can do both at certain parts of their life cycle. And we do find them globally in their marine distribution. All right, so there's our information about the sponges. Okay, they're sessile. They don't move very much. They spend most of their time marine, suspension feeding. They do have motile larvae. Okay, so again, one of those characteristics is that an animal must move at some point, so it may not move in its adult life cycle. These guys reproduce asexually. They produce egg and sperm in some cases as well, so they can reduce both asexually and sexually. And they live a lot of times in a symbiotic relationship with other photosynthetic organisms like protists or cyanobacteria. Different shapes, different sizes of sponges, lots of diversity based on the spicules that are actually making them up, and that gives them their different appearance. Okay, so you can see here is circular sponge. You can see a little bit about what's going on there. Inside, water coming in. They don't have true tissues. They're parazoans, and they are filter feeders. So very, very simple animals. There's your cnidarians, your jellyfish, found everywhere. One of the key differentiating structures of synaptomorphic structures is a specialized cell called a cnidocyte, which is used in prey capture. So this thing is really cool. This is what stings you. So not so cool if you've ever been stung, but the cnidocyte senses prey, forcibly ejects a barbed spear-like structure that may contain toxins. Barbs hold the prey, and the toxins subdue it until it can be brought to the mouth and ingested. So not a super pleasant thing if you're prey of a cnidarian. All right, so there's your jellyfish, your cnidarians. You've got different types. You've got kind of the upside down ones and the polyp structure, and then the medusa is the more common structure of the jellyfish that you're probably used to seeing with the dome on top. But the polyp is where you see like the hydra as being like a polyp, and then the medusa being the jellyfish. So where we usually find these are areas where where we usually find jellyfish, and more specifically here corals, are going to be areas that are nutrient poor and hold little food for suspension feeders like coral polyps. So coral polyps are the larva of coral. So you've all seen or heard of probably a coral reef. There's some pictures there at the bottom. But you usually see that crystal clear, beautiful water of a coral reef. And, in terms of what's going on in there, that crystal clear water is very nutrient poor. So here at the Jersey Shore, our water doesn't look as clear as, say, the water in the Caribbean, but it doesn't mean that water's dirty. It just means that our water has a whole lot of phytoplankton and nutrients in it. It's really great, ecologically speaking, our water. It might be dirty in some places, but for the most part, it's not the dirt that's giving it kind of the not clear color. And actually, this summer, that I've been down there, it's a lot clearer than it's been, which is kind of cool. But the water in the Caribbean is actually ecologically dead, and the coral is able to survive in that ecologically dead water because of its ability to get into a symbiotic relationship with algae. And when this coral gets into a symbiotic relationship with algae, it can then provide the basis for the ecosystem of all the other animals that we find in a coral reef. So coral reefs are vastly important. But we're seeing a problem now where coral reefs are becoming endangered. Okay, so as the temperature of the ocean increases and the ocean becomes significantly more acidified, we start to see more CO2 in the ocean. That's affecting the ability of coral reefs to produce their outer shells and to also, live in that symbiotic relationship with algae, because the algae is dying. So we need that. We need that calcium carbonate endoskeleton that is produced is what's left behind when the zooxanthellae die. So we see something called coral bleaching occur. So healthy coral has the coral and the algae living together in a symbiotic relationship. When stressed, the algae can leave the coral, and then we end up with this coral bleaching, and bleached coral does not have its normal source of food from the algae and is in danger of dying or may even be dead at that point. So what are some things that lead to this? Change in the ocean temperature caused by climate change and things like that, runoff and pollution. High temperatures are going to really increase the amount of sunlight. High solar irradiance contributes to this, and also extreme low tides can lead to bleaching in shallow corals because they're not covered by the water, which provides some protection from that UV light. Right? Sea anemones are mentioned are like kind of upside down jellyfish, and sea anemones live in a symbiotic relationship with clownfish. I'm sure you've remember from Finding Nemo, where the clownfish are protected from the sea anemone. It doesn't sting them. And the clownfish actually draw in little tiny fish and things like that that the sea anemone benefits by eating. So they mutualistically help each other. Hydra, these guys are really tiny. Again, they're a type of cnidarian here. They have a mouth, tentacles, and a lot of times you'll see these as a classic example of a predator species that's going to eat Daphnia or water fleas, and they bud off to asexually reproduce. So the life cycle of jellyfish has both a sessile polyp form that reproduces asexually and a free-floating medusa that reproduces sexually. Anemones and corals exist only as polyps and never as the medusa form. Right, so there's the information at the bottom about the cnidarians. So in this figure, you're looking at the basic cnidarian life cycle, and it can include, a polyp and a medusa form. So this specific example is a hydrozoan called Obelia, and we find these attached to seaweed, shells, or rocks, and they can contain hundreds of polyps here. So, here's our medusa form, male producing sperm, egg. They come together to give you a zygote. You get a larva, okay? In this case, our larva is going to grow into its polyp form, and the polyp form is going to produce reproductive structures from it. This polyp form will then produce these reproductive structures that will grow into the full-grown medusa. So some kind of end here. They don't undergo this reproductive polyp mitosis stage. They just stay at the polyp stage. So anemones just stop here, but jellyfish continue on. Okay, so that will end this chapter 30 on Introduction to Animals. I will see you next time.